So in a video a couple of days ago, I discussed Magic Johnson versus Stephen Curry, and in that video, I soft launched a take that I've been feeling for a while now, which is that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is just a tad overrated. I want to make it clear from the onset what I actually think about his all-time ranking and whatever. My main issue, and the reason I do think that Kareem is a little bit overrated, is he is pretty much by default put in the number 3 player spot. Like when people do all-time lists, when they do top 10 best player of all time lists, greatest player of all time lists, Kareem will be number 3 pretty much across the board for most people who aren't, really going outside of the box. Kareem at 3 is essentially the norm. Most people would acknowledge that LeBron and MJ are a tier above him, but they almost act like he's a tier above everybody else in the top 10, and that's where I disagree. He is a very clear tier down below Jordan and LeBron, and then guys like Kobe, Duncan, Bird, Magic, Hakeem, Bill Russell. I don't think from there Kareem is any much more higher of a level than those guys were. I'll explain that, but first, if you are new here, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and give us a like. It helps the video do better in the algorithm, so it's much appreciated. And check this out as an audio-only experience over on Spotify as well as Apple Music. We finally have the link for that, or Apple Podcasts. A couple of years ago, I made a video called Kareem's GOAT Case is Dying, and my main argument was that the only thing he really had on his side was longevity, and LeBron has essentially passed him in the longevity department. I never really hard committed to him actually just straight up being overrated, so here's the take. Let's start with Kareem as an actual talent, what he was capable of as a basketball player. First and foremost, he's known for the skyhook, and it only makes sense because he's the only dude who's ever consistently done it well. Hook shots still very prevalent. Hook shots a big part of a lot of scorers' arsenals, but the skyhook in particular is just next level unstoppable. And unfortunately, they didn't have efficiency metrics for that area of the floor at the time. They didn't start doing that until the 90s, but I did see some guy on Twitter who watched a bunch of his old games and did the numbers on it. He was in the 60s percentile wise on those shots. So to have access to a shot that is unblockable, unstoppable, you can get it pretty much whenever you want, and it's like a 60% chance it goes in, that is extremely valuable, and that's essentially the foundation that his entire game was built upon. But that's not the only thing that he could do. He also had a bit of a jump shot. He would shoot a mid-range jumper. I guess in the 70s it was just a jumper at points, usually not more than 10, 12 feet from the basket, usually bank shots, and sometimes he would do this shot that's kind of a blend between a layup and a jump shot, like a leaning in jump shot, I guess. But he had good touch on that, and I wouldn't be surprised if he shot decent percentages on them. You can see a good amount of them in his old highlights. And he was also freakishly athletic earlier on in his career. In college, he was dunking so much and so effectively that it was banned. He was not allowed to dunk in college anymore. That's when he developed the skyhook. He was allowed to dunk in the NBA, and that he did earlier on. He has plenty of posters and plenty of times that he yammed on really good players. And he's a super strong defender. He was one of the best in the NBA. He had really high block numbers. They didn't track them the first couple of years of his career, and that's when his numbers at large were a little bit more inflated, so I am curious what his block per game average was in those earlier years, but they started tracking it 1974. So in his 5th season, they started tracking blocks, but he averaged 3.4 in his prime years and 2.6 for his career in general. So Kareem was by far and away the best player in the 1970s. He didn't really deal with Wilt. He didn't deal with Bill at all. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, he was drafted the season after Bill Russell retired. Didn't have a lot of competition at his position, and for the 70s in general, it's not the strongest era in terms of superstar talents. He did not have much people competing with him, both for championships and, more importantly, for MVPs, more importantly in this case. First of all, the ABA merger didn't happen until 1976. Until then, some of the best basketball players in the world were not in the NBA. Artis Gilmore, Julius Erving, George Gervin, even Rick Barry for a certain amount of time. That is huge. That means that a lot of people who would be capable of winning an MVP in his era were just simply not there to compete with him. Julius Erving won 3 consecutive MVPs in the ABA after his rookie year. You don't think maybe he could have been getting in those conversations with Kareem? He even did get into serious place in the MVP voting. I don't know why I'm stumbling on that. Speaking of those MVPs, let's just go ahead and look over each one individually, because not having that competition was a huge factor. So his first one in 1971, obviously Bill Russell was retired and out of the equation, and Wilt was old, not nearly as good at his peak. The next year in 72, he still managed to get 4th in MVP voting. He was still not nearly the player that he used to be, especially when he was three-peating MVPs. In 72, he didn't really get much of a race because the two runners up were Jerry West and Wilt Chamberlain. So they kind of just took away from each other's cases. And if either of them had a stronger year and didn't have to share the ball or didn't have to share the spotlight on the team, they might have actually put up a real fight. The only 2 MVP races that were like really close for him was 1976 and 1974. That was thanks to Bob McAdoo, who had a short peak, but when he was at his peak, he was putting up numbers and still wasn't as good as Kareem, but probably the number 2 player in the league at a point. His 77 MVP, there was essentially no competition that year. And his 1980 MVP is kind of BS to me as well, because this was after 77. He didn't get it for 78 or 79. He wasn't even all that high in voting those years because the Lakers were not all that relevant and were not doing all that well. They were getting 40-something wins every season. Then in 1980, their record jumps dramatically. The only reason that happened is because they drafted Magic Johnson. The roster was almost exactly the same as it was the year before. They just added Magic Johnson and improved by 13 wins. So this rookie comes in, makes your team a 60-win team when you weren't capable of doing it yourself, and then you get an MVP out of the exchange. So there's a lot of years where he won MVP because there's just nobody else to give the award to. It was very, by far and away, he was the best player in the NBA. So you would think, especially in the older eras of the NBA, having the best player in the NBA and being the best player in the NBA by a wide margin means you're winning a lot of rings. It always means you're winning a lot of rings, unless you are Kareem, because he only got 1 ring in the 1970s. It was in the 1971 season with his duo with him and Oscar Robertson. Despite the fact that he was by far and away the best player, and despite the fact that he didn't have terrible help around him, I realized the default thing here to do is go, well, what did his help look like? He had Jamal Wilkes on his team on the Lakers, who was a multiple-time All-Star. He had Norm Nixon, who was a borderline guy, and then he would become an All-Star after Magic joined the team, and they were a 60-win team. But all-star caliber players were around him in LA, and he wasn't even getting to 50 wins in that context. He won MVP in a year that he fucking missed the playoffs. I believe there was some weird complication with like how the playoff standings worked back then, but either way, MVP missing the playoffs is crazy. He had not terrible help. He didn't have the best help in the world. I'm not saying he got the most lucrative situation around him plausible, but like the fucking Washington Bullets won a championship in the 70s. Like fucking Wes Unseld, averaging 13 points per game, is winning championships, but you can't do it with an all-star teammate and a decent roster and a decent coach. Didn't win championships in the 70s, won a bunch of MVPs because no one else could really win them. So let's move on to his actual numbers. His peak scoring numbers. From 1969 to 1981, he averaged 28.1 points, in 40.5 minutes a game. Now, the reason I highlight the minutes is that's a lot of fucking minutes when you compare him to later on in the NBA. Dudes really don't play more than 36 unless they absolutely have to. In a postseason setting, they will. But this is regular season we're talking, and the guy's sitting for 7.5 minutes a game. There's also a matter of pace. The 70s were a high-pace era, and teams were scoring a good amount of points. The way that you eliminate pace and minutes from the equation is you look at per 100 possession tracking data. Unfortunately, this is another one where they didn't have that data until 1973-74 season is when they added it. And from that stretch, unfortunately, that does skip the 2 times he won a scoring title in his first 3 years, but his overall scoring average over that stretch minus those 3 years is 26.5 points, so it's not that much lower than it was otherwise. Looking at that stretch, so from 1973 to 1981, per 100 possessions, he averaged 30.6 points on 59% true shooting. I'm gonna mention the true shooting for all these examples I'm about to list, but bear in mind, efficiency has gone up as time has gone on, so Kareem was really efficient for his time, for what it's worth. 30 a game, per 100 possessions, good efficiency, ain't bad. Curry, from 2015 to 2021, he averaged 40.1 points on 65% true shooting per 100 possessions. KD's peak scoring from 2009 to 2016, he averaged 38.7 points on 62% true shooting. Michael Jordan, in his peak from 1986 to 1993, peak as a scorer that is, he averaged 41.7 points on 59% true shooting per 100 possessions. So already we're talking about a handful of guys who are in the 40-point mark. Even James fucking Harden, at his scoring peak from 2014 to 2020, he averaged 41 points on 61% true shooting per 100 possessions. And then LeBron, he did it 37.4 points, 59% true shooting in his peak. Kobe, 37.6 points on 56% true shooting. So all of these guys are higher volume from a possession-to-possession standpoint. They are more threatening as a scorer. And the reason that Kareem ended up having the all-time scoring title until he didn't was because he played until he was 41. The number one thing that Kareem had going for him was his all-time scoring numbers, but the reality is him as a peak, him scoring at his peak was not as good as a handful of players. There are guys who have higher per 100 scoring numbers that I just didn't bother listing because there's enough examples here, but per possession wise, Kareem was not that special of a scorer. In terms of volume, the skyhook's still fucking ridiculous. I'm happy to acknowledge that. But let's move on now to the years beyond his peak, because this is what I think inflates people's idea of Kareem the most. The championships that he racked up when he was the second and third best player on these teams. Having help is not a problem. I don't want to knock players too much for their help, but when you're comparing them, you have to look at the difference. And Magic is all-time great player, and then the Lakers just had a bunch of great role players, or like Jamal Wilkes, James Worthy, Norm Nixon, other all-star guys in the fold. As a result, Kareem ends up being the best player for one of the Lakers championships, maybe two. It's arguably two. And then he is the second best player for two of those rings, and the third best player for one of them. There is even one when he was 39 where you could have argued James Worthy was actually the better player, and there were 2 titles that he won as the third best player on the team. That's all well and good, and I'm not saying those rings don't count for his legacy because he wasn't in as prominent as a role, but we know that all rings are not created equal, and winning one as the best player multiple times is generally the benchmark for being in a GOAT conversation, for being, to so many people, clearly in the top 3 of all time. Like, if Michael Jordan or LeBron had multiple titles where they were not the best player on the team, you would hear about that shit all the time. It would be the #1 most prevailing narrative against either of them. However, Kareem gets a pass because I feel like a lot of people don't know or pay that much attention to that aspect of things. And from like 1982, 83 onward, Magic is essentially just a way better basketball player than Kareem was. So, to put this into perspective, for his last 3 rings, 1985, 1987, and 1988, he is 37, 39, and 40 for those rings. He averaged 18 points a game, 6.7 rebounds, and 1.8 blocks during the playoff runs for those championship seasons. 18 points, 6.7 rebounds. That is really not amazing, and it's certainly not in the upper echelon of finals performances. Now, Kareem is 40, 37, and 39 for these championships. So I understand why he's not as good as he was earlier on in his career. It only makes sense that that happens. That's what normally happens. However, first of all, for Magic, so many people will discount Magic's rings because he had Kareem on the roster, even though he's just an 18-7 guy. So from that point of view, Magic, like, you can't have an 18-7 guy on the team. That can't be your second best player. That can't be your third best player, especially when in 1988 he's averaging 14 points and 5.5 rebounds. That's not enough. Like, I don't understand that being a knock against Magic, but Magic being the best player on those teams for year after year and winning those 3 titles to add to Kareem's resume is never brought up against Kareem. He was the best player in his era by far. In the 1970s, it's Kareem, and then it's a debate who the second best was. After that, the 1980s, he's still MVP level in the first couple of years. But then from like 1983 onwards, when the Lakers win a majority of their championships, when they won 3 of them, he's an 18 point per game scorer. And all of his MVPs, almost all of them, were kind of just default MVPs. Like, yeah, you're the best player in the league, here's the MVP. And I'm not saying every MVP race has to be a great MVP race, but I think the 6 MVPs thing with Kareem gives you an inflated sense of like his dominance. And to me, if you're a 6-time MVP and a 5-time in the same era, literally you won half of the MVPs of the decade and you get 1 championship out of it. That's kind of ludicrous to me. He was by far and away the best player in the league. Like, it wasn't close. Like, remember how we felt about LeBron in 2013? And it's like, well, this guy's just so much better than everybody else. It's hilarious. That's exactly what was happening at this time in the NBA with Kareem. And he still couldn't get more than 1 title at his absolute peak. He won 1 in 1980, where he should have won Finals MVP. Ironically, he was robbed of Finals MVP in 1980 by Magic Johnson, and then might have been 85 or 83, whichever one it was, Kareem robbed Magic in that Finals MVP run. I think Magic was by far and away the best player in that series by a large margin. It's essentially a swap, you know. Fair is fair. They both got the Finals MVPs out of it, but I just feel like if LeBron or MJ had any of these things working against them in any capacity, no way would they be considered the GOAT, and no way would they be considered like clearly the 3rd greatest player of all time. I think that from number 3 to number 10, or around that ballpark, maybe number 11 or 12, just about everybody who you would typically see in that area of all-time lists, you can kind of mix them up. Like, if you have Kareem at 5 and Magic at 4 and fucking Kobe at 5, I don't agree with that. That's not what my list looks like, but I understand where you're coming from. There are guys that you can rank over Kareem that are not just LeBron and Michael Jordan. That's essentially the only real gripe that I have. The dude is still one of the greatest players of all time. He would be in my personal top 5. He's not my number 3, and he's not by far and away my number 3. That's my thoughts. Let me know what you guys think down below. I realize this will be a controversial video, so I hope we can keep it civil. But that is it. Shout out to Nick for editing this video, and goodbye.